If you ever hear a human answer that question without smiling, stop laughing immediately. I wish someone had told us that before combat psychology started on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning at the Orion Strategic Academy. My name is Lieutenant Sereth Vaughn, and for 14 standard cycles I had watched cadets from 21 species swagger into my classroom convinced they understood warfare. Every semester began the same way. The predators mocked the scholars. The heavy world recruits mocked the light world recruits. Everyone found someone smaller to laugh at. And then there was the human. Caleb Mercer arrived exactly 3 minutes before class, carrying a faded duffel bag that looked older than half my students. His uniform was clean, but worn around the cuffs. His boots had been repaired enough times that they looked like they belonged in a museum instead of one of the galaxy's most prestigious military academies. He nodded politely to no one in particular, chose the seat in the back corner, rested the bag beside his chair, and quietly waited for class to begin. No dramatic entrance. No arrogant stare. No attempt to impress anyone. That alone made several cadets decide he must be weak. It always amazed me how quickly confidence became arrogance inside a room full of future officers. The Varkin cadets whispered first. Then a pair of towering Croth soldiers started placing friendly wagers on how long the human would survive advanced field exercises. Someone behind them claimed Earth had only earned admission because the council wanted diversity statistics. Laughter rolled across the lecture hall like it belonged there. Caleb never reacted. He simply folded his hands on the desk and watched the holographic display warm to life with the patience of someone waiting for delayed public transportation instead of listening to strangers measure his worth. I should have recognized that expression. Veterans were silenced differently. They do not avoid attention because they fear it. They avoid attention because they know exactly what follows when it finally arrives. The lesson that morning focused on combat records and operational credibility. Every cadet would introduce themselves, state their specialty, and answer a series of routine questions designed to evaluate battlefield awareness. Harmless, predictable, educational. At least that was the plan. The introductions moved from row to row. Pilots proudly listed flight hours. Engineers bragged about simulation scores. Security specialists exaggerated stories from training exercises until even their own teammates rolled their eyes. The room grew louder with every answer, confidence feeding confidence. Then the rotation reached the back row. One of the Croth cadets leaned across the aisle with the grin of someone certain he had already won an argument that had not even begun. He looked directly at Caleb Mercer, chuckled loudly enough for the entire classroom to hear, and said, "Hey, human, before you tell us your specialty, answer something more interesting. What's your kill count?" The entire lecture hall erupted with laughter, and every eye turned toward the quiet man in the last seat, waiting for the joke to land. The laughter echoed for several more seconds because nobody expected the human to answer immediately. Caleb Mercer did not roll his eyes. He did not sigh. He did not even glance toward the students who had started the joke. Instead, he looked at the digital nameplate on his desk, as though making certain he was being addressed correctly. Then he slowly raised his eyes toward the Croth cadet with an expression so calm that it almost felt out of place inside a room filled with smug confidence. I watched carefully because silence often revealed more than words. Most recruits rushed to defend their pride. They argued. They exaggerated. They tried to sound dangerous. Caleb simply waited until every voice faded on its own. Even the students who had been laughing the hardest gradually stopped, mostly because the human refused to reward them with any reaction. There was something strangely disciplined about the way he occupied the room. It reminded me less of a student and more of someone attending a briefing that had already become predictable. The Croth cadet folded his arms and grinned even wider. "Come on," he said. "Surely every Deathworlder keeps score." More chuckles spread through the classroom. Someone else called out that maybe humans counted training drones instead of real combat. Another student suggested that surviving Earth traffic probably qualified as military experience. Again, the room laughed. Caleb rested one hand on the old duffel bag beside his chair. It was an ordinary motion, almost absent-minded, but it caught my attention because the fabric looked unusually worn. Not damaged from neglect. Worn from years of being carried from one assignment to another. Military equipment develops a language of its own, and experienced officers learn to read it without realizing they are doing so. Before I could speak, Caleb finally answered with a question of his own. His voice was steady, polite, and almost conversational. Are we talking about confirmed records, operational estimates, or missions that remained classified? The room went completely still. It was not the words themselves that changed the atmosphere. It was the way he delivered them. There was no sarcasm, no attempt to sound impressive. He asked with the same tone someone might use while asking whether a report should be printed in color or black and white. Several cadets exchanged uncertain looks. The Croth student blinked once, clearly unsure whether the human was making fun of him or taking the question seriously. I felt something tighten in the back of my mind. Experienced instructors develop instincts for moments that do not fit expectations, and this moment suddenly felt very different from every classroom joke I had witnessed before. Curious, I opened Caleb Mercer's Academy profile on the instructor console. His photograph appeared immediately, along with basic enrollment information. Human, Earth, exchange program. None of that surprised me. Then I noticed that nearly every section beneath the public record had been replaced with gray authorization bars. Training history restricted. Previous assignments restricted. Service evaluations restricted. Operational certifications restricted. Every attempt to expand another section returned the same quiet message across my screen. Access denied. Authorization level insufficient. I had taught future admirals, royal guards, and decorated veterans from across the galaxy. I had never seen an exchange cadet whose background required more clearance than the instructor responsible for evaluating him. For the first time that morning, I stopped looking at the screen and looked directly at Caleb Mercer. He was still sitting exactly where he had been, hands relaxed, expression unchanged, patiently waiting for someone to decide which version of the question they truly wanted answered. No one volunteered to laugh anymore. It was remarkable how quickly confidence disappeared once certainty left the room. The Croth cadet who had started the exchange leaned back into his seat, pretending he had never expected a serious response, but his eyes stayed fixed on Caleb Mercer with growing uncertainty. I recognized that look. It was the expression every officer eventually wore after discovering that the quietest person in the room often knew the most. My instructor console continued rejecting every authorization request I attempted. I even submitted my senior faculty credentials, something I had never needed inside a classroom before. The answer remained identical. Access denied. Personnel record protected under Intergovernmental Security Directive. A small golden insignia appeared beneath the warning, then disappeared almost immediately, as if the system itself regretted showing it. I had seen that symbol only once before during a classified briefing involving joint operations between Earth and the Galactic Council. Exchange students did not receive files protected at that level. Decorated commanders did. Veterans of politically sensitive campaigns did. The realization settled into my thoughts like a weight. Across the room, one of the engineering cadets tried to recover the atmosphere. He forced a laugh and shrugged. Maybe Earth likes making ordinary service records look mysterious. A few students smiled politely, but nobody committed to the joke. Even they could feel that something had shifted. Caleb simply waited. He never interrupted. He never demanded respect. His patience became strangely uncomfortable because every passing second invited everyone else to fill the silence with their own assumptions. Finally, I folded my hands behind my back and addressed him directly. Cadet Mercer, I said, if you are unable to discuss your background because of classification, you are not required to answer personal operational questions inside this classroom. It was the simplest way to end the discussion without embarrassing anyone further. Most recruits would have accepted the escape immediately. Caleb surprised me again. He shook his head once. I am allowed to answer, he said calmly. I only wanted to know which record they were asking about. That sentence landed harder than any dramatic speech ever could have. Which record? Not whether one existed. Not whether he had one. Which one? Several cadets exchanged nervous glances. The Varkin student who had spent the morning boasting about simulation victories quietly closed the statistics displayed on his tablet. Another recruit stopped recording the class, slipped the device into his pocket, and looked toward me as though expecting the lecture to continue. I almost wished it could. Instead, my curiosity overcame my caution. Explain the difference, I said. Caleb nodded respectfully, as though the question finally made sense. Confirmed records require direct verification, he replied. Operational estimates include situations where complete documentation was impossible. Classified missions follow different reporting standards. He spoke with the smooth precision of someone repeating procedures that had become routine years ago. There was no pride in his voice. No excitement. Just familiarity. That disturbed me more than anything else I had heard all morning. Around the classroom, no one whispered anymore. Every student watched the human in complete silence, waiting for the answer that only moments earlier had seemed like nothing more than the setup for another harmless joke. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Even the environmental systems seemed louder than the students who had filled the room with jokes only minutes earlier. I had planned an ordinary lecture on battlefield decision-making. Instead, every lesson I intended to teach was quietly slipping away because one human refused to play the role everyone had assigned him. Caleb Mercer glanced around the classroom, making brief eye contact with each cadet. There was nothing challenging about his expression. If anything, he looked mildly concerned that the discussion had become uncomfortable. "I did not mean to interrupt your class," he said. "I only wanted to answer the question correctly." That sentence unsettled everyone again. It was not confidence. It was sincerity. The Croft cadet cleared his throat before forcing another smile. "Fine," he said. "Then answer it correctly." His voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. Caleb nodded once. "Very well," he replied. "Before I do, understand that Earth and the Council use different accounting systems. Some campaigns combine multiple engagements into one operation. Others separate every verified incident. If I give you one number without context, it will be misleading." Several students instinctively opened their tablets. Nobody was laughing now. They were taking notes. The transformation happened so naturally that I almost missed it. The same room that had treated the human like entertainment had quietly begun treating him like a guest lecturer. I folded my arms and decided not to interfere. Whatever happened next would teach more than anything stored inside the academy curriculum. Caleb continued in the same calm voice. "Our instructors always emphasize that numbers are poor measurements of service. The mission matters more than statistics. The people who return home matter more than records." I noticed several cadets glance toward one another. That philosophy was unusual. Most military cultures celebrated personal achievements first. Humans, apparently, viewed the subject differently. Or perhaps this particular human did. I could not tell which possibility fascinated me more. One student near the front finally raised a careful hand. "If numbers are not important," she asked, "why does your government classify them?" Caleb thought about the question for a second before answering. "Because numbers without history become stories. Stories become legends. Legends encourage people to make dangerous assumptions." Nobody interrupted him. Every sentence seemed to raise two more questions. I quietly reopened his restricted profile, hoping the system had updated after our conversation. Instead, another notification appeared across the display. "Observer detected. Record access logged. Federal oversight acknowledged." My pulse actually quickened. Someone outside the academy had just noticed that I was viewing my own student's file. That had never happened during my career. Whatever Caleb Mercer had done before arriving here, it had attracted attention far beyond our classroom. When I looked back toward the rear of the lecture hall, he had not moved at all. His hands remained folded on the desk, his old duffel bag resting beside him, his posture perfectly relaxed. Only one detail had changed. Every student who had entered the room believing the human needed to earn their respect was now waiting quietly for permission to hear the rest of his answer. The silence lasted long enough for everyone to realize it had become a part of the lesson. No instructor had ordered it. No rule required it. The room simply understood that interrupting now would feel inappropriate. Caleb Mercer glanced toward the academy clock before returning his attention to the students. It was the kind of habit people developed after years of schedules that rarely changed. "There is one more thing," he said. "Every organization defines a successful mission differently." The statement sounded simple, but it immediately drew everyone's attention. Several cadets leaned forward without realizing they had done so. The curiosity that had replaced their earlier amusement continued to grow. Caleb rested both hands on the desk and spoke with the same steady tone he had used from the beginning. "Some missions are measured by objectives completed. Others are measured by lives protected. Sometimes the official record only reflects what can be verified after everything is over." No one challenged him. Even the Croth cadet who had started the conversation remained completely still. I watched the expressions around the room change one by one. Confidence became uncertainty. Uncertainty became genuine interest. They were no longer trying to expose the human. They wanted to understand him. I activated another instructor terminal, hoping a separate network would provide additional information, but the results surprised me even more than before. Instead of opening his service history, the display presented a short advisory message. Personnel record available only through authorized military liaison. Civilian academic access suspended. The message disappeared almost immediately, replaced by the Academy logo. It was as though the system wished to remind me that certain histories belonged somewhere beyond a classroom. I looked back toward Caleb. His expression had not changed once. There was no satisfaction in seeing everyone's attention fixed on him. If anything, he appeared slightly uncomfortable that a routine introduction had become the focus of the morning. A student from the navigation program finally spoke. Does Earth really classify something as ordinary that everyone else would consider extraordinary? Caleb smiled politely, but it was a tired smile rather than a triumphant one. Perspective changes everything, he answered. If you grow up surrounded by one reality, you stop thinking of it as unusual. The words lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. I noticed several cadets quietly closing the competitive ranking charts they had opened before class. The conversation no longer felt like a contest. It felt like an opportunity to learn from someone whose experiences reached far beyond the academy walls. I realized then that the lecture had shifted in a way no lesson plan could have predicted. The students had expected another transfer cadet. Instead, they had encountered someone whose calm, measured answers hinted at a history far larger than anyone in the room had imagined, and every person present understood that the next question would matter far more than the first. The atmosphere inside the lecture hall changed so gradually that nobody could identify the exact moment it happened. Earlier, the students had been competing for attention. Now they were listening for every word that left Caleb Mercer's mouth. Even those who normally challenged every instructor remained silent. I realized that curiosity had replaced pride, and curiosity was far more powerful inside a military academy. Caleb looked around the room before speaking again. There is another reason numbers are difficult to discuss, he said. Different governments define service differently. One of the science cadets frowned. How can service have different definitions? She asked. Caleb answered without hesitation. Because not every assignment is intended to win a battle. Some exist to prevent one. That response produced another wave of thoughtful silence. It was not mysterious because of what it revealed. It was mysterious because of what it carefully avoided revealing. He never claimed greatness. He never suggested he was exceptional. He simply described experience as though it were another ordinary administrative procedure. I found myself studying the expressions around the classroom. The Croth cadet who had begun the conversation no longer looked amused. Instead, he appeared genuinely interested, almost embarrassed by his earlier confidence. Several students had stopped taking notes altogether, preferring to remember each sentence exactly as it was spoken. I checked the Academy network one final time, not expecting anything new. Instead, an unfamiliar notification appeared in the corner of my instructor display. External archive synchronized. Limited historical reference available. My attention sharpened immediately. The restricted service file remained sealed, but one public document had become visible. It was not a personnel record. It was a lecture distributed years earlier to senior officers across multiple member worlds. The title caught my attention before I even opened it. Operational Psychology: Why Human Combat Records Should Never Be Compared Across Civilizations. I stared at the words for several seconds. The document contained no names, no classified operations, and no statistics. It only explained that human military reporting often reflected cultural standards that differed significantly from those used elsewhere in the galaxy. A single paragraph stood out. It warned instructors against judging human experience solely through numerical records, because context determined the meaning of every entry. Suddenly, Caleb's earlier explanation made perfect sense. He had not been avoiding the question. He had been trying to prevent everyone from misunderstanding the answer. I closed the document and looked back toward him with entirely new respect. He was still sitting quietly in the last row, waiting with remarkable patience, while an entire classroom slowly caught up to a reality he had understood all along. The room no longer viewed him as an outsider from a distant death world. They viewed him as someone carrying knowledge earned through experience rather than theory. Then the academy intercom chimed softly. Normally, that sound announced routine schedule updates. Instead, a calm, automated voice delivered a message that caused every instructor terminal in the building to illuminate at once. Faculty notice. Visiting personnel from Earth Military Liaison have arrived on campus. Priority meeting requested with instructors currently assigned to exchange Cadet Caleb Mercer. Nobody in the classroom spoke. They simply looked from the glowing displays to the quiet human in the back row. And for the first time that morning, I realized the academy had not sent us an ordinary student. It had entrusted us with someone whose presence alone required attention from governments across the galaxy. The announcement faded, but its effect remained. Every pair of eyes shifted between the instructor displays and Caleb Mercer, as though the room itself had forgotten how an ordinary class was supposed to continue. Caleb, however, reacted with nothing more than a quiet nod. "They are earlier than I expected," he said. His voice carried no excitement and no concern. It sounded like someone noticing that a scheduled shuttle had arrived a few minutes ahead of time. That simple reaction somehow made the entire situation even more unusual. The Earth Military Liaison was not the kind of office that visited classrooms without reason. I dismissed the notification from my screen and faced the class again. "Cadet Mercer," I said carefully, "before we conclude this discussion, I believe everyone here still has one unanswered question." He looked at me politely. "Which one, Lieutenant?" "The one that began all of this." A quiet murmur passed through the lecture hall, but nobody interrupted. Nobody joked. The earlier confidence had disappeared completely. The Croth cadet who had started the conversation slowly stood from his chair. There was no arrogance left in his posture. "I should apologize," he said. "I asked because I assumed it would embarrass you." Caleb gave a small smile. "You do not owe me an apology. You asked a reasonable question. You simply did not know why humans usually avoid answering it." That response surprised everyone again. There was no resentment in his words, only patience. Another student spoke from the center row. "Then why do humans avoid it?" Caleb considered the question before answering. "Because people often assume the number tells the whole story. It never does." He glanced toward the large academy emblem hanging above the front of the classroom. "Every record represents decisions, responsibility, and people who trusted you. Turning those experiences into a competition misses the point." The room remained silent. Even the students who had arrived determined to prove themselves against every other species seemed to recognize that the conversation had moved beyond simple comparisons. I noticed several cadets lowering their eyes, reflecting on his words instead of preparing another challenge. Caleb reached down and adjusted the old duffel bag beside his chair. The motion was calm and familiar, as though he had repeated it thousands of times throughout his career. He never tried to appear impressive. In fact, the less attention he sought, the more impossible it became to ignore him. Then another notification appeared across my instructor console. This one did not request a meeting. It simply displayed a short message from the visiting Earth delegation. "Faculty guidance. Do not request operational details from Cadet Caleb Mercer in an academic setting. His service history remains protected by mutual agreement between Earth and the Galactic Council. Educational discussion may continue at the cadet's discretion." I read the message twice before looking back at him. The delegation had not instructed us to stop the conversation. They had trusted Caleb himself to decide what could be shared. That level of confidence was extraordinary. Around the classroom, every student seemed to realize the same thing at nearly the same moment. Whatever answer Caleb chose to give next would not come from obligation. It would come because he believed the class was finally ready to hear it. No one looked toward the door when footsteps finally approached the classroom. Every student remained focused on Caleb Mercer instead. Whatever importance the visiting delegation carried, the answer sitting quietly in the last row had become far more compelling. The classroom doors opened without ceremony, and 3 representatives from the Earth Military Liaison entered in dark blue uniforms bearing no medals, no decorations, and almost no identifying insignia. The oldest among them surveyed the room with a calm smile before addressing me. "Lieutenant Vaughn, please continue your lesson. We are only here as observers." That response surprised me more than their arrival. If they had crossed half the sector simply to observe a lecture, then this class clearly mattered for reasons beyond ordinary education. The senior representative glanced toward Caleb. The two exchanged a brief nod that lasted less than a second. No salute, no formal greeting, just quiet recognition between professionals. The official then turned back toward the class. Cadet Mercer has permission to answer questions at his own discretion, he said. We ask only that everyone remembers context is often more important than statistics. Hearing almost the exact same words Caleb had repeated throughout the morning changed everything. His explanations had not been personal opinions. They reflected official doctrine. The students realized it immediately. One of the navigation cadets slowly raised her hand. If numbers are so misleading, why do people keep asking about them? The Earth representative smiled gently. Because numbers appear simple. Reality rarely is. He stepped aside and allowed the attention to return to Caleb without adding another word. The silence that followed no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt respectful. Caleb stood for the first time since class had begun. He adjusted the sleeves of his worn academy uniform and rested one hand on the back of his chair. Standing somehow made him appear no more intimidating than before. If anything, he looked like an ordinary man who happened to carry extraordinary experience with remarkable humility. He looked around the room before speaking. You asked for a number, he said. I can give you one. Nobody reached for a tablet. Nobody whispered. Every student simply listened. Caleb continued in the same measured voice. The official record lists 73 confirmed combat eliminations across multiple campaigns. A few cadets quietly inhaled, but no one interrupted. Before anyone could react, Caleb calmly added another sentence. That number has never been the part one remembered. The room remained completely still. The Earth representatives said nothing. They did not appear surprised because they had likely heard those words before. Caleb looked toward the Academy emblem once again. I remember the names of the people who came home afterward. I remember the families who received messages saying someone they loved would be walking through the front door again. Those are the numbers that mattered to me. No dramatic speech followed. No attempt to impress anyone. Just quiet honesty. In that moment, I realized the greatest difference between the human and the rest of us had never been experience or training. It was perspective. The students had expected a legend defined by statistics. Instead, they found a professional who measured success by responsibility, and somehow that made the quiet man in the back of the classroom seem far more remarkable than any number ever could. The class officially ended 5 minutes later, yet not a single cadet stood when the dismissal tone sounded. For the first time since I had become an instructor at the Orion Strategic Academy, nobody seemed interested in being the first through the door. They remained exactly where they were, quietly absorbing a lesson that had never appeared in the Academy curriculum. The representatives from Earth gathered near the entrance. Without interrupting the silence, they had not come to defend Caleb Mercer. They had not come to correct him. They had simply confirmed what every student had already begun to understand. The human had never exaggerated a single word. I closed my instructor console and looked across the room. Earlier that morning, I had believed I was responsible for teaching future officers how to evaluate military experience. Instead, one quiet exchange had exposed the greatest flaw in our own thinking. We had spent years comparing civilizations by technology, fleet size, and statistics. Humans, it seemed, measured success by responsibility and restraint. That difference explained more than any classified record ever could. The Croth cadet slowly approached Caleb after the other students made room for him. There was no trace of mockery left in his expression. He extended one hand. Thank you, he said simply. I asked the wrong question. Caleb accepted the handshake with an easy smile. Most people do the first time, he replied. The better question is always what someone learned, not what number appears beside their name. Around the room, several cadets nodded without speaking. I could almost see their assumptions changing in real time. They had arrived believing humans earned respect through intimidation. They were leaving with a very different understanding. Respect had never come from the number Caleb finally shared. It came from the way he refused to let that number define him. One of the Earth representatives turned toward me before leaving the classroom. Lieutenant Vaughn, she said, today's discussion will probably be remembered longer than most tactical lectures. I smiled in quiet agreement. It already has been, I answered. After they departed, I remained alone in the lecture hall for several minutes, looking at the empty seats where future commanders had witnessed something none of them expected. My lesson plan still waited on the display exactly as I had prepared it the night before. I archived it without hesitation. It was no longer necessary. The students had learned something far more valuable. They had discovered that wisdom often arrived without ceremony, that experience rarely needed to announce itself, and that the calmest voice in the room could carry the greatest weight. Years later, whenever new exchange cadets arrived from Earth, I noticed something had changed throughout the academy. Nobody greeted them with jokes about their homeworld. Nobody asked for combat statistics during introductions. Instead, the first question almost everyone asked was, "What can we learn from you?" That single change became part of our academy culture, passed from one graduating class to the next. And whenever young officers asked me why the tradition began, I always gave them the same answer. Never judge a human by the number they are willing to share. Judge them by the quiet confidence that tells you there is always more to the story than any record could ever reveal.